On behalf of the Humanities Council, I would like to thank you for your enthusiasm and loyalty to this First Wednesday series, which clearly I'm biased, but I think is just a remarkable offering. I say statewide, it's in 9 different locations around the state, but I think the quality of the talks which are offered is exceptional. And in that line, tonight's speaker, Randall Balmer, is the John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College. Before coming to Dartmouth, he was Professor of American Religious History at Columbia University for 27 years. He has been a visiting professor at Princeton, Yale, Northwestern, and Emory universities, and in the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He was a visiting professor at Yale Divinity School from 2004 to 2008, and he earned his PhD from Princeton University in 1985. Balmer, an Episcopal priest, is the author of a dozen books, including God in the White House, How Faith Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. His second book, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America, now in its 4th edition, was made into an award-winning 3-part documentary for PBS. Professor Balmer was nominated for an Emmy for writing and hosting that series. His latest book is The Making of Evangelicalism, From Revivalism to Politics and Beyond. So please join me in welcoming Professor Balmer.
Thank you very much. Good to be here, back here at Isley. Thank you for that nice introduction, Frankie. And I feel like I'm coming over a little bit too strong. Thank you for allowing a Dartmouth guy to come to Middlebury. I appreciate that. We're here to talk about evangelicalism, and particularly evangelicalism in America, but I want to go back a little bit farther into history and talk about terminology. Who do we mean by evangelicals when we talk about that movement of those people, and the term evangelical itself, which actually refers to the New Testament, to the first 4 books in the Bible of the New Testament, written by the evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the term evangelical refers to the gospel, or what Christians believe is the good news of the New Testament. The term evangelical took a little bit different valence in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses on the cathedral door at Wittenberg and launched his attack against the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church more generally. And so evangelical came to be associated with Protestantism. And so that even today you have in Germany, the Protestant churches are known as the Evangelische churches, a variation on the term evangelical. In America, what happened, or in North America, evangelicalism emerged from the conflation of what I call the 3 Ps in the 18th century. New England Puritanism, Scotch-Irish Presbyterianism, and Continental Pietism. And those came together in an event that historians call the Great Awakening. Roughly the 1730s and 1740s, although down in Virginia it was a little bit later, more in the 1750s. And that Great Awakening, which is a series of revivals that convulsed the Atlantic seaboard, became the formative moment for evangelicalism in North America. Itinerant preachers would travel up and down the seaboard and preach to large audiences. Most famous of whom was George Whitefield, who had been trained in the London theater. So he knew the importance of dramatic pauses and stentorian voice to be able to communicate to thousands of people Benjamin Franklin calculated that he was preaching to 10,000 auditors on Society Hill in Philadelphia with his very strong stentorian voice. And in a tradition that had at that time, in a culture that had at that time no theatrical tradition, he was very, very effective with the colonists. Contemporaries said he could bring tears to your eyes simply by saying, Mesopotamia. So Whitefield and others travel through the Atlantic colonies and the Atlantic seaboard, and they bring an evangelical message to the colonists in the Great Awakening, fusing together those three P's: Puritanism, Presbyterianism, and Pietism. I think it's possible even today to see remnants of all three of those sources in contemporary evangelicalism. For example, from the Puritans, evangelicals inherited the notion of introspective piety. Puritans were always looking inside to figure out how they were doing on their spiritual pilgrimage toward heaven. That's why they kept journals and diaries. They wanted to make sure that they were on course in godliness. I think from the Presbyterians, evangelicals inherited the importance of doctrinal precisionism, making sure you hold the right doctrines. And I can attest that there are seminary jobs won and lost over the tiniest little doctrinal minutia among evangelicals because they regard that as so important. And finally, from the Pietists, they inherited the importance of a warm-hearted, affective piety. It wasn't enough merely to have intellectual assent to evangelicalism. You had to feel it. You had to feel the warmth. What we see that in today in the Pentecostals, for example, that was present as well, albeit in somewhat attenuated form, in the Great Awakening in the 18th century. What happens after the Great Awakening is you have the American Revolution, and then you have another series of revivals that historians rather unimaginatively call the Second Great Awakening in the decades surrounding the turn of the 19th century. And this convulses the new nation in three different geographic theaters. One of them was here in New England, primarily emanating out of Yale. It was a fairly buttoned-down, straight-laced revival, but nevertheless it was a revival in the early part of the 19th century. I've read accounts of revivals in places like Hanover, New Hampshire, and believe it or not, Woodstock, Vermont, during this time, during the Second Great Awakening. The second theater for the Second Great Awakening was the Cumberland Valley of Kentucky. This is the camp meeting age, when people would gather for a week or 10 days of sermonizing, socializing with their neighbors, and many evangelical conversions took place in this second phase of the Second Great Awakening, although critics contended that more souls were conceived than converted. The third theater of the Second Great Awakening took place in the new nation, and that was in the upstate area of New York, in an area that was recently opened for settlement by the construction of the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. This was the era that brought evangelical social reform into American society. People like Charles Grandison Finney, who was really the leader of the Second Great Awakening up in upstate New York, particularly in Rochester, New York, and others, talked about the importance of reforming society according to the norms of godliness. And so evangelicals were very active in the early part of the 19th century in trying to bring about reform in America to create a godly society. So they were active, for example, in various peace crusades before the Civil War. They were active in prison reform, the whole idea of a penitentiary, a place where a felon could go not merely to be segregated from the rest of society, but could go also to become rehabilitated and constructively rejoin society at some point. Evangelicals were very much involved in the public education movement known as common schools in the 19th century because they recognized that education was the key for economic advancement. For those in the lower rungs of society, this was the way that they were going to be able to ascend into the middle class. Evangelicals were involved in the temperance movement. We think of temperance today as kind of a paternalistic, retrograde movement. But in the 19th century, alcohol abuse was rampant. And so they were addressing very real social ills including child abuse and spousal abuse in the temperance movement. And finally, evangelicals were also engaged in the anti-slavery movement in the North. There were some evangelicals in the South who did support slavery. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But in the North in particular, they were active in the abolitionist movement, and they were also active in the movement for women's equality, including the radical proposition that women should be allowed to vote. All of this emerges out of evangelicalism in the antebellum period, particularly in upstate New York, but all of evangelicalism was affected by this. I don't have time to go through the entire 19th century, but what happens toward the end of the 19th century is that evangelicals begin to rejig their understanding of their responsibility to the larger world. They adopt a mode of biblical interpretation from a man from Britain by the name of John Nelson Darby, something called dispensationalism, and I'd be happy to go into this later if you want to get into the weeds on this, but dispensationalism reoriented their thinking, and so they began to worry not so much about reforming the present world, but more in terms of evangelizing others and preparing for the second coming of Jesus, which they thought would occur at any time. And this has enormous implications for evangelical attitudes towards society in the 20th century, as we'll see here in just a minute. We'll take a moment to kind of pause in the historical narrative to talk about a definition. We've talked about how this came about, but what makes an evangelical? And I contend that there are three characteristics that make an evangelical. First, an evangelical is someone who believes that the Bible is God's revelation to humanity. Therefore, it should be taken very seriously and probably interpreted literally. Although I always contend that evangelicals engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism rather than strict literalism. But nevertheless, evangelicals would affirm that the Bible is very important. Remember the Protestant Reformation I mentioned a little bit earlier. I'm teaching a course on the Protestant Reformation right now, so it's fresh in my mind. Martin Luther insisted on what he called sola scriptura. The Bible alone is the source of authority. And evangelicals, being Protestants, understand that very well. And they try to take the Bible very seriously. They try to apply it to their lives, both devotionally, personally, but also as it relates to the larger society. So that would be the first characteristic of an evangelical. The second is that an evangelical believes in the centrality of a conversion or a born-again experience. This comes primarily from the third chapter of St. John in the New Testament, when Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night and asks Jesus how he, Nicodemus, can be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus replies that Nicodemus must be born again, or in some translations, born from above. This is the genesis of the term born again or born again Christian. So evangelicals believe that this sort of conversion, this sort of religious transformation is the key moment in an individual's life. And so an evangelical will be able to recount very often the circumstances surrounding her or his conversion. I was converted on June 17th, 1982. I was about to be taken in for surgery. My roommate in the hospital read to me from the Bible, and I accepted Jesus into my heart. I became born again at that moment, and it changed my life. This would be a fairly common formula for an evangelical conversion. And very often these are recounted time and time again among evangelicals themselves as they talk about their testimonies, they would call it, or more recently, the younger generation tends to talk about faith journeys. It's a little bit different nomenclature these days among evangelicals. So that would be the second characteristic of an evangelical, the centrality of a conversion or a born-again experience. And the third characteristic is that evangelicals take seriously the command of Jesus to spread the word, to spread the gospel. The so-called Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all people, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So an evangelical would attest to the fact that he or she has a duty or an obligation to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. I will say that it's my observation over the last 50, 60 years or so that evangelicals talk about doing this much more than they actually do it. They tend to hire professionals to do it for them, missionaries or visitation pastors or outreach ministers on megachurch staffs and so forth. But an evangelical would acknowledge his or her responsibility to bring others into the fold. So you have a threefold definition: the Bible as God's revelation, the centrality of a conversion experience, and finally the mandate to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. In terms of numbers, I think the best estimates have the number or the percentage of evangelicals in America right now at about 33%. About 1/3 of the population would fit that definition. It's a movement that is huge. It's been very important throughout American history, very much misunderstood, which I guess is why I'm here. And but nevertheless, a huge and very influential movement that continues to exert its influence in American society. Let me pick up with my historical narrative that will bring us toward the present. I'm guessing that maybe a few of you want to talk about the number 81, 81% of white evangelicals who supported Donald Trump in this last election. Am I right maybe about that? Okay, we'll talk about that. But let's get there first. What happens in the early part of the 20th century is that evangelicals are still socially active, a bit less so because they had adopted this dispensationalist theology, but they're still pushing for women's rights, women's equality. They're still pushing for the right of workers to organize against predatory capitalists. This is in the Gilded Age. And what happens is that they are also very often pacifists. By any measure, the most important, influential evangelical in the early part of the 20th century was William Jennings Bryan, 3-time Democratic nominee for President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, until he resigned when Wilson went into World War I. And Bryan resigned because of his pacifist scruples. Bryan also, sadly, plays a role in another important step in this historical progression, and that, of course, is the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee in July of 1925. The so-called standoff between creation and science. What happens then is an important moment for a lot of reasons, and I'm happy to talk about this in more detail if you'd like, but it's an important moment because even though Bryan really won his case, that is, John T. Scopes was convicted of violating the Butler Act and was fined $100. Even though Bryan won the case, evangelicals lost rather notably in the larger courtroom of public opinion. And what happens after the Scopes trial is that they begin to withdraw from the larger society. They become persuaded that American culture is both corrupt and corrupting. And they proceed to construct what I call the evangelical subculture in America, which was this vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, colleges, Bible institutes, seminaries, publishing houses, Bible camps, missionary societies that become a kind of shadow network in the larger American society. It was a defensive posture against what they regarded as the corruptions in the larger world, so that it was possible in the middle decades of the 20th century to grow up within that evangelical subculture and have very, very little commerce with anyone in the larger world. And I can attest to this personally. This evangelical culture was almost a seamless garment. It was kind of a hermetically sealed universe against what was regarded as the depredations of the larger society. So from the Scopes trial of 1925, and to some degree that's an artificial demarcation, but it works pretty well for understanding what happened. From the Scopes trial of 1925 up until the mid-1970s, so really 50 years, a half a century, evangelicals were, by and large, withdrawn from the larger society, hunkered down into their subculture, a kind of fortress against this larger world. They were not politically engaged. Yes, we had people like Billy Graham who surfaced to the top because of his media savvy and because he was an extraordinarily charismatic individual. But for the most part, evangelicals are not involved in the larger society, certainly not in politics, and not in any organized way. Many evangelicals were not even registered to vote because they believed Jesus was coming at any time. Why bother with this tawdry world? Let's just put our house in order, make sure our friends and families are all converted, and we will go up to heaven with Jesus when he returns, which could be at any moment. Please understand, I'm not exaggerating about that. That this was a very real sense among evangelicals, is that Jesus may come before we finish this gathering tonight. Jesus could come at any moment, and you had to be ready. And there's a whole kind of industry. Some of you remember the Left Behind books. That's what this comes from. This is from dispensationalism, and I could get started on it, but I won't right now. Let's keep going. So, in terms of social engagement, political engagement, from 1925 until the mid-1970s, evangelicals are simply not active, not engaged. What happened? The 1970s turns out to be a turning point. It's a turning point for several reasons. First of all, in the fall of 1973, in Chicago, Illinois, over Thanksgiving weekend, 55 prominent evangelical leaders gather at the YMCA on Wabash Street to craft what they call the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And you can find this on the internet. I invite you to look for it yourself. Make sure you look for the 1973 version of that declaration. The Chicago Declaration was a remarkable restatement of evangelical social and political concerns from the 19th century. For example, they talked about the sin of persistent racism in American society, much the way that antebellum evangelicals would talk about the scourge of slavery. They talked about the growing gap between the affluent and everyone else in American society. They talked about the scandal that in an affluent society like the United States, there are people who are hungry. They talked about the scandal of militarism. Remember, this was toward the end of the Vietnam War in American society. And they also reaffirmed evangelical commitment to women's equality. Wow. November 1973, the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. Not 6 months later, an event happens down in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia Law School. An event for graduating seniors, graduating lawyers, called Law Day. And every year, the graduates invite prominent individuals to come and address them on Law Day. U.S. senators, governors, attorneys general, Supreme Court justices, whoever they choose that year. In fact, that year, the keynote speaker was Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts, who talked about the impeachment proceedings that were, at that time, working their way through the House of Representatives. The undercard speaker that day was the governor of Georgia, a man named Jimmy Carter. And after Kennedy had sat down, during lunch with all the dishes clattering as people were having their lunch, Jimmy Carter got up and extemporaneously began to talk about his understanding of justice and how he came to his understanding of justice. And he credited two prominent theologians for informing him about justice. One was, perhaps not surprisingly, Randall Balmer, who often said that the sad duty of politics was to establish justice in a sinful world. And Jimmy Carter, throughout his career, has talked about that quote and what that meant to him and how it helped to shape his understanding of his responsibility as a political figure. The second theologian that Jimmy Carter credited for his understanding of justice was the venerable theologian Bob Dylan. especially Bob Dylan's song, Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More, that talks about the plight of tenant farmers. Carter goes on to talk about the importance of trying to establish justice in a sinful world. Talked about what he was trying to do as governor of Georgia, for example, to reduce the population of people of color in Georgia's prisons, which was far out of kilter with the percentages in the population. He talked about the scandal that people in Washington, in regulatory agencies, were the very people who came from industries they were supposed to regulate. Doesn't that make you sound familiar? During the course of his lecture, Carter noticed that one of the reporters covering the event had slipped out of the gathering and then came back a little bit later. And initially he thought that Hunter S. Thompson of Rolling Stone magazine was simply going to refresh whatever adult beverage he was consuming that day. But it turns out that Hunter Thompson was going to his car to retrieve his tape recorder, to record something quite extraordinary. A politician willing to tell the truth. A politician willing to speak truth to the powers that be, as he did at that Law Day address. Well, 6 months after that, Jimmy Carter, on December 12, 1974, improbably announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president in 1976. And he also declared that he was an evangelical, born-again Christian. And this was momentous. First of all, it sent every journalist in New York to his or her Rolodex to figure out what in the world he was talking about. But it also caught the attention of evangelicals themselves, who noticed that here was a candidate for the presidency being taken seriously by the media, who was unabashed about his faith, talking about the importance of his faith in shaping his policies as governor and as a candidate for president. You all know what happened in the 1976 campaign. Jimmy Carter eked out a victory over Gerald Ford, who of course had risen to the presidency after Nixon's resignation in 1974. What is sometimes forgotten is that Jimmy Carter was on course for a landslide victory in that election, but for the fact that about 5 weeks before Election Day, Playboy magazine hit the stands with their interview of Jimmy Carter, in which he said he had lusted after women other than his own wife in his heart. The media made a huge deal out of that. That's an utterly unremarkable statement for evangelicals. That is utterly unremarkable. Remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, "You've heard it said, thou shalt not kill. I tell you, if you hate your brother, it's as though you killed him. Thou shalt not commit adultery. If you lust on someone other than your wife or spouse," to broaden this, "it is as though you've committed adultery with that person." It's an utterly unremarkable comment, but the media went crazy with it. I remember one of the editorial cartoons showed Jimmy Carter watching or looking at the Statue of Liberty in the state of Honduras and things like that. All sorts of silliness. And Jimmy Carter's poll favorable ratings dropped 15% after the Playboy interview. Had he not given that Playboy interview, and I understand why he did it, and I've talked to him about it, and so forth, but it was a miscalculation on his part. He would have won by a much larger margin in 1976. The point for our discussion here is that evangelicals came to the polls, in part for the novelty of being able to vote for one of their own for president. So Jimmy Carter begins to lure evangelicals out of their subculture and into the larger political sphere. Then what happens? Well, as you know, those same evangelicals who had helped propel Jimmy Carter to the White House turned dramatically against him 4 years later in favor of Ronald Reagan. Now, you all remember, I'm just judging by the, seems to be the ages in this room. You all remember that the late 70s was a fraught time in American society. Inflation was up in 20% territory. We had an energy crisis. prompted by the Arab oil embargo. You had the taking of the hostages in Iran, all sorts of things going wrong. If anything could go wrong during a presidency, poor Jimmy Carter had to deal with it. I've said many times that he was dealt a bad hand as president, and it was a hand that in many ways he played badly, and I think that he probably would even acknowledge that himself. Nevertheless, evangelicals turned against him from 1976 to 1980. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it has resonance or has meaning for understanding the current political situation. The standard narrative is that evangelicals became politically active and organized politically in direct response to the Roe v. Wade ruling of January 22nd, 1973. They were so morally outraged by Roe v. Wade that they realized that they could no longer be inactive politically. They had to rally in order to reverse this terrible decision. It's a story that's been repeated many, many times by people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and other leaders of the religious right. So much so that it's become kind of ingrained into our understanding of what happened during the 1970s. It's a wonderful story. It is also utter fiction. In 1968, there was a gathering of evangelicals convened by Christianity Today magazine, which is sort of the flagship magazine for evangelicalism, and another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society, precisely or specifically to discuss the issue of abortion and contraception. These top-tier theologians met for several days, and at the end of their conference, they issued a statement saying, "We really can't decide if abortion is morally wrong, but we think that it probably should be allowed." 1971, the delegates, or they call them the messengers, of the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in St. Louis, Missouri. Not exactly a readout of liberalism, the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. A resolution they reaffirmed in 1974, a year and a half after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, several prominent evangelicals, including W.A. Criswell, one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade ruling as marking an appropriate distinction between public policy and personal morality. I call this the abortion myth. The abortion myth is the fiction that the religious right galvanized as a political movement in response to Roe v. Wade. It simply is not true. For most of the 1970s, evangelicals regarded abortion as a Catholic issue, not an evangelical issue. What really happened? Well, it's a longer story, but it's worth going into it. What provided the catalyst for the mobilization of the religious right was a court decision, but it wasn't Roe v. Wade, and it wasn't the Supreme Court. It was a court decision in a case called Green v. Connolly that was decided by the District Court for the District of Columbia on June 30th, 1971. Now let's pull back and look at the background. After the Brown v. Board of Education ruling of May 1954, which mandated the desegregation of public schools, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by Lyndon Johnson, schools were required to desegregate, and segregation was outlawed in public institutions. Down in Holmes County, Mississippi, which was in many ways a typical Southern community, several so-called segregation academies began to crop up during the push for desegregation down in Mississippi. The number of white students in the Holmes County public schools in the first year of desegregation dropped from over 700, I forget the number, something like 740 to 28. The second year of desegregation in Holmes County, the number of white students dropped to 0. At the same time, these segregation academies were applying to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. And several families in Holmes County, Mississippi said, this isn't right. They filed suit. Long story short, their suit was joined by several other similar suits around the country. And the case finally worked its way up to the district court in the District of Columbia. And on June 30th, 1971, the district court ruled that any institution that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination, is not by definition a charitable institution. Therefore, it has no claims on tax-exempt status. And do you think maybe that got the attention of Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia? Do you think maybe that got the attention of the president of Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina? You bet it did. And that is what got the religious right going as a political movement. Nothing to do with abortion. Nothing to do with abortion. It was a defense of racial segregation in segregation academies and places like Bob Jones University. Just to play out what happened with the Bob Jones case, as some of you will remember, by the fall of 1982, at this time Ronald Reagan is president, the case comes up to the Supreme Court, and the Reagan administration announces that it is going to argue before the Supreme Court on behalf of Bob Jones University that it should be allowed to keep both its racial policies as well as its tax-exempt status. The outcry was so great that the Reagan administration backed down. The case went before the Supreme Court, and in May of 1983, the court issued its decision, 8-1 against Bob Jones University. The sole dissenter, anyone know? Associate Justice William Rehnquist, the man that Reagan later elevated to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is the abortion myth. How did abortion become part of the conversation? And I don't know how much time I have here. Chris, help me out here.
Keep going.
Got another half an hour.
Oh! I don't think I can go that one. All right. The genius of the early leaders of the religious right, particularly Jerry Falwell. Now we're talking about Jerry Falwell Sr., not the junior who now runs Liberty University, and Paul Weyrich, who is really the architect of the religious right. Their genius was to recognize that if they wanted a widespread grassroots evangelical movement, they had to have an issue other than defense of racial segregation. And so, according to Weyrich, and he told me this personally, he's now deceased, but he told me this personally because I was at it's another story, but I had a conference where these matters were being discussed. According to Weyrich, he'd been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to enlist evangelicals as a political movement. And he told me directly, he said, I tried everything to get them involved, get them interested in politics. I tried the school prayer issue, and many of you remember that school prayer in the early 1960s was a big issue for a lot of folks. He said, I tried the pornography issue, I tried the women's rights issue, I tried abortion. Nothing got them interested in politics until the school cases came along in the 1970s. That's what finally got them interested in politics. But he also recognized he needed something bigger. And what happens is that in 1978, during the by-elections, Weyrich goes to the head of the Republican National Committee and says, I want some money to get these people organized and get them active in politics. And the head of the NRC, according to Weyrich, looked at him like he was crazy. Who are these people? I don't know. I'm not going to give you this money. And Weyrich decided at that time that he was going to go out and elect some pretty improbable people in the midterm elections of 1978. And he focused his efforts on New Hampshire, when Thomas McIntyre, the Democratic senator, was running for re-election. He focused his efforts on Minnesota, which had 2 Senate seats up for election. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale. And also in Iowa, where the incumbent Democratic senator was a man named Dick Clark, not that Dick Clark, a different Dick Clark, who was very popular and was running for re-election. And in all 4 of those Senate races, during the final weekend of the campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 of those Democratic candidates lost to anti-abortion Republicans. Wyrick had his issue. When I was doing research on this, I was reading through his papers, which are probably enough, at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming. And as I was reading through the papers around that election, it's almost like the papers are sizzling, because he realized he finally found an issue that was going to work for evangelicals. Even so, according to Frank Schaeffer, who was very active during this time, it took a while for evangelicals to get up to speed on the abortion issue or the anti-abortion issue. In early 1979, Frank Schaeffer tours the country among evangelicals with a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that featured his father, Francis Schaeffer, who was sort of the intellectual godfather of the religious right, and a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia named C. Everett Koop. And in that series of films, Schaeffer and Koop argue that any society that countenances abortion will also very quickly embrace infanticide and euthanasia. And as that film series begins to circle the country in early 1979, evangelicals begin to get tuned in to the abortion issue. But even so, as late as August of 1980, it was still uncertain whether abortion was going to work as a political issue. Some of you remember during that campaign, one of the key moments occurred in on August 22nd actually, down in Dallas, Texas, when Ronald Reagan addresses this huge gathering of evangelicals, somewhere between 10 and 15,000. This is the moment when he said famously, "I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing." Brought down the House and arguably sealed the evangelical vote for Reagan in 1980. I read through his speech on that occasion, out at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley. And during that speech, Reagan talks about creationism. He says if he were on a desert island, the one book he would want was the Bible. He talks about the tax issue that I just mentioned here, the tax exempt status for segregation academies. He does not mention abortion in front of 15,000 cheering evangelicals in August of 1980. Even that late, it was uncertain that abortion was going to work as a political issue for these evangelical voters. Well, what happened? As you know, in 1980, Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter, so evangelicals turned against one of their own, a born-again evangelical Christian, in favor of Ronald Reagan, who was divorced and remarried. Up until that time, that was a taboo among evangelicals. Now we're on 3 marriages, but at the time, that was a huge issue. I did a survey of Christianity Today magazine looking at the anti-divorce articles in the 1970s as opposed to 1980. And I forgot exactly what the numbers were, but the numbers dropped from 30-something to almost 0 in the 1980s because evangelicals suddenly were not concerned about divorce any longer, they were concerned about abortion instead. It was a huge sea change for evangelicals at the time. I think what has happened since then, since 1980, is that evangelicals, and it certainly is the case, that abortion has become a huge issue for them, at least an older generation. The younger generation, not so much, but the older generation is very much tuned into that issue. But in aligning themselves with the Republican Party, they have also aligned themselves with policies very much at odds, I would argue, with 19th century evangelical sensibilities. And I would go even farther and say very much at odds with the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, who repeatedly called on his followers to care for the least of these. Mm-hmm. And I simply don't see that sort of emphasis in the agenda of the religious right since 1980. Let's jump now quickly to the 2016 presidential election, when 81% of white evangelicals, and white is important here, supported Donald Trump, the family values candidate. I think three things were going on here. I think the first is that the religious right has been pillorying Hillary Clinton for so long that I think many evangelicals simply couldn't envision the possibility that they would pull a lever for Hillary Clinton in a presidential election, or any election for that matter. I've talked to several people who are in that camp, and that's the first thing they say when they try to explain their vote. My response is to say, well, why didn't you stay home or vote for somebody else? But nevertheless, that's beside the point here. I think the second reason is that Donald Trump is very, very skilled at what I call the rhetoric of victimization. Now, it's usually about him, almost always about him, but the rhetoric of victimization is something that evangelicals have responded to very strongly since the origins of the religious right. Oh, it's our values that are under attack. We're the ones who are a minority in the society. We're the ones who are being aggressed by what's happening in American society with court decisions and so forth. And I think it was very easy for them to identify with this rhetoric of victimization because they've been using that and responding to that about themselves for very long. And I think finally, probably the most important reason is that the 2016 election allowed evangelicals finally to dispense with the fiction that theirs was a movement about family values. I don't see how you could make the case, given their votes, that they were supporting family values in the 2016 election. And it also allowed them, frankly, to circle back to the founding principles of their movement, which was rooted in racism. And they supported, I think by any even objective standard, a candidate who was openly racist in 2016. And that's one of the real scandals, I think, of the 2016 election and, frankly, the religious right. My own sense about evangelicalism after 2016 is that it died on November 8th, 2016. This is a movement that's so riddled with compromises that it no longer has any moral core whatsoever, no longer has any moral center. And I regret that, I lament that, because again, looking at evangelicalism through the long range of history, I see the ways in which evangelicalism really did contribute to American society in many productive ways. Some not so productive as well, and I'm willing to acknowledge that. But if you look at the overall record, particularly in the 19th century, evangelicals were a force for good in American society. And I think tragically that's been lost as the religious right has displaced other voices among evangelicals. I think I'll leave it there and invite your questions. Yes, please.
I'm not hearing you say anything about the fact that there may be a schism in the evangelical movement, given that what their founding principles were in their beginning and the way they've changed. They're so unified.
Would that there was. I don't know. The question was, I'll restate a little bit. Is there any evidence that there's a schism developing among evangelicals on these matters? And there has always been an evangelical left. I mean, the most dramatic example was the Chicago Declaration in 1973, but it's been a minority movement within evangelicalism for the most part. And I think the other reason it didn't take off is that the leaders of this group, and probably the most prominent one would be Jim Wallace of the Sojourners Fellowship, Jim's a wonderful guy, he's a great friend, but he doesn't have the media empire behind him the way that Jerry Falwell did, or Pat Robertson. And so what happened in the 1980s in particular, and beginning in the late 70s, is that these religious right leaders were able to flood the media with their rhetoric and with their political leanings. And this has left the left out of the picture for the most part. There are people who are trying to fight back against this. I think there is a bit of a generation gap. I don't want to overstate that, but younger evangelicals, as I understand it, don't feel quite the same way on a lot of these issues. I began to see that in the 2008 election, actually, when perhaps you remember that both James Dobson and Chuck Colson said the only salient moral issues are abortion and same-sex marriage. And what I was hearing from a cohort of younger evangelicals is, wait a minute, we see a whole broader range of moral issues, including the environment, which is very, very big and very much on their minds, as it should be, poverty, war, the invasion of Iraq, and so forth. Those were considered moral issues as well. I just don't have a sense of how strong that movement is. And I keep coming against the number 81%, and I think I think the odds are probably pretty long. Now, there is talk about reformulating and re-identifying themselves in some way, and not using the term evangelical. I've even seen the word ex-evangelical. I don't know if that's going to catch on. Please.
Do you really think that the abiding concern about abortion is infanticide and euthanasia?
No, I don't think it is.
That?
No,
It's about women, right?
Yeah, it is about women, and I want to be careful here because I want to make clear. I think that many people involved in the anti-abortion movement are utterly sincere about this, and this is not. They're not engaged in this for some ulterior motive or even to suppress women. I don't think that's the case. That may be how it's read by people. That may be the purpose of some people within that movement. But that doesn't take away from the fact that many people who are engaged in this movement are true believers on that issue. They do see it as a moral issue, and they don't. And for that reason, they really can't back down from it. But yes, I think there was the New York Times that showed a roster of the senators in the Alabama Senate who voted for this latest bill, and they were all white men. And we have to deal with that. Please.
What can you tell us about the Northfield conferences
Yeah.
back in the 1900s?
Well, that has to do with dispensationalism I mentioned earlier, so let me go into it quickly. We get lost in that that question. What happens in the 19th century is that in the early part of the century, there was a great deal of optimism among evangelicals that they could reform society and bring about the millennium, the 1,000 years of righteous rule predicted in the book of Revelation. So they thought, and that was in large measure what animated their social reform efforts. They were trying to build a godly society. And they were doing so, as I said, with public education, rights for women, and so forth. What happens later in the 19th century, I think beginning with the Civil War, the carnage of the Civil War, but then accelerating with urbanization and industrialization, the influx of non-Protestant immigrants who didn't share evangelical scruples about temperance. What happens is that they begin to look around themselves, say in 1880 or 1890, and say, wait a minute, we thought we were building godly society here on earth, particularly here in America, but look at those teeming, squalid tenements on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They don't exactly resemble the precincts of Zion. And we maybe need to rethink our approach. And along about that time, the chronology is a little off because he had been active before that, but this guy comes in from Britain, John Nelson Darby, and says, you guys have been reading the Bible all wrong. Jesus is not going to return after you build this heavenly kingdom. Jesus is going to return before you build this heavenly kingdom, which means Jesus will return at any time. So if you think about that, how is that going to affect, I'm going to get back to Northfield in a minute, how is that going to affect your attitudes towards society? Are you likely to engage in any long-term building projects? No, you're not. And I have this whole riff about evangelical religious architecture. I'm serious. Cinder blocks. and I'm not trying to be facetious here. That was the ethic. Jesus was going to come at any moment. What Northfield and Dwight Moody, their contribution is that they popularized dispensationalism. So he had these summer conferences at Northfield, also up in Niagara, Ontario, which is another prominent venue for these conferences. And evangelicals would come from all over the country and listen to these teachings from these preachers and evangelists who had themselves adopted this new scheme of biblical interpretation called dispensationalism. I'll explain the term here very quickly. And I'm happy to get in the weeds, but I think you probably don't want me to do that. What dispensationalists said is that God has dealt differently with humanity in different ages or dispensations throughout history. So God had a particular deal with Adam, and then Adam and Eve ate the apple, and so God had to strike a different deal with with Noah, and then a different deal with Abraham, and a different deal with ancient Israel, and now we're living in the church age, and so God has a particular arrangement with the church, the Christians. And the payoff on this dispensationalism stuff is that we are now on the cusp of the final dispensation. So Jesus will return at any moment, and then we'll usher in the events prophesied in the book of Revelation. This is what the Left Behind series is all about. It's about this, the rapture and the tribulation and all that stuff. And you don't want me to get Yes, here,
One of the right-wing evangelicals, I think it's Falwell, has issued a coin with a picture of Trump and Cyrus of Persia on it. You want to say a little something about that?
Yeah, as I understand it, the Cyrus stuff is it's trying to justify supporting an immoral ruler, I think is what it means. So Trump is God's vicar right now for the United States in their
God's biggest mistake.
You don't have to be a good person to be useful to God, I guess that would be.
Yeah, no, that's the argument, right? Is that God can use flawed vessels, and as a person of faith, I actually believe that God can use flawed vessels. Some are pretty flawed. Please.
Just had trouble. Franklin Graham, as you know, spoke last night.
No, I didn't. What do you say about that?
Oh, no, I didn't hear him. He spoke in Essex, on Essex Junction last night to thousands of cheering Vermonters. I find it hard to understand where the hate for non-Christians comes from, how he squares that with Jesus' love. And Jesus was sorry the guy couldn't thread the needle, but he didn't hate him. Where does this hate come from, and how does he defend it?
Repeat the question, please.
Question?
The question was, explain Franklin Graham.
Explain his hate.
And his hatred. Let me talk about his father quickly. I don't know if I can answer your question, but I'll try to approximate an answer. I have to say, I actually did a PBS documentary about Billy Graham, and I admire Billy Graham. I have to say, which I'm not blind to his faults or shortcomings, but Billy Graham was really quite a remarkable man. But what made him such a man, in part, was that he decided at an early point in his career to forsake the narrow, constricted fundamentalism of his childhood in favor of a broader, more capacious evangelicalism that worked with other religious leaders, that worked with Catholics, worked with liberal Protestants, for example. And by the way, the fundamentalists never forgave him for doing that. But Graham made that transition Franklin, his son, in my judgment, did the opposite. That is to say, Franklin grew up in an evangelical household, obviously. You can't get more evangelical than Billy Graham. And yet, Franklin Graham decided to trade that for this hard, starchy, condemnatory fundamentalism. Can I explain it? No. I mean, I think to explain it, you have to kind of enter into his psyche in some way that I'm not able to do.
So he doesn't justify it. He doesn't say.
Well, he would say, I mean, he would point to a passage in St. John where Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me," Jesus. So he would use that as a justification. Now, I think there are a whole lot of ways to argue with that interpretation, but Franklin Graham has chosen not to do that. So I'm sorry to hear that he was here in Vermont. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Frankie.
Could you talk a little bit about the evangelical movement and the state of Israel?
Yeah, sure. Yes, it's tied back into dispensationalism in large measure, but evangelicals regard Israel as God's chosen people. Now, the fundamental miscalculation there is they're confusing, in my judgment, the relationship between God and ancient Israel and the Israelites with the modern contemporary state of Israel. And so for that reason you have all of these people, including Franklin Graham actually, who talks about how American foreign policy needs to favor Israel in certain ways. The big guy who's the loudest voice on this is a guy by the name of John Hagee down in San Antonio, Texas, who keeps insisting on this sort of thing. But that's what's behind the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and so forth. It's an odd situation in many ways. I like to say that evangelicals are simultaneously pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. And what I mean by that is that from a Jewish perspective, what evangelicals want ultimately to do is convert Jews to Christianity. And they believe that is one of the preconditions for inaugurating all of these apocalyptic prophecies that they think are coming at any time. And part of that is rebuilding the temple and reestablishing animal sacrifices and that sort of thing. But more generically, it manifests itself in an Israel right or wrong sort of position.
You talked about the long range of history,
Yeah.
how relatively quickly things have changed. You know, with your crystal ball, if you were to look out to, say, 25 years, what might be the best and worst case scenarios as far as what happens in the movement?
The question is, looking ahead 25 years, what's the best or the worst case scenario? I usually deflect those questions by saying I'm a historian, not a prognosticator. To me, the best scenario is that evangelicals will reclaim their heritage. Their heritage as people who take the words of Jesus seriously. Now, if you look seriously at the words of Jesus, he says a few things about divorce. He says a few things about other things. Nothing about abortion, by the way. Nothing about same-sex marriage or sexual identity. He has a whole lot to say about caring for those on the margins of society. In fact, he says that come Judgment Day, his followers are going to be judged on how well and how many times they visited the prisoners and took care of the orphans and the widows and so forth. So the best case scenario is that somehow there will be a change of heart. Now, I've written and talked about the death of evangelicalism, but I'm a person of faith. I'm a believer. I also read in the New Testament that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, even though he'd begun to smell after a few days, right? So if I believe that, which I do, I believe it's possible that evangelicalism will eventually recover its better self. Worst case scenario? Geez, hard to imagine. Hard to imagine any lower than where we are right now, actually. In my saner moments, I think that the worst case scenario has already taken place. That is, the movement has been hollowed out by moral compromises, and there's nothing left to it. And I think I'm sad about that. I have to say I'm sad about that.
Could you elaborate on that?
Oh,
What?
The hollowed out and the part that you're sad about.
Well, I'm sad because evangelicalism has a noble history, and it's.
No.
You're circling.
No, my question was, what do you think is lost that's not coming back, that you can't come back?
The social conscience, the prophetic voice, and I think part of that is there was a kind of Faustian bargain struck in 1980. I think 1980. I sometimes say that evangelicalism died on November 8th after a long illness contracted in 1980, and I think there's some truth to that, but. My sense as a student of American history, particularly American religious history, is that religion always functions best at the margins of society and not in the councils of power. Because once you begin to hanker after political power, you lose your prophetic voice. And it's been lost. And for evangelicals, it's been lost. No, I mean, you know, bless him, Jim Wallace is carrying on, Lisa Sheridan Harper, Tony Campolo. I mean, Tony's 110 years old, and he's still out there on the lecture circuit. I mean, he's bless him. He's fighting the good fight. But you know, coming back to the 81%, it's been lost, I think.
There's a misconception. Our candidate for the last presidential election was Ben Carson, and we really liked him. I followed him for a long time. And he's made a recent comment. Of course, you know where he went. But he said, I've dealt with racism a lot, and this president is not a racist. And there's a guy should know. So we have a lot of miscommunication going on. I believe that too. My own interesting was a Carson fan, and he dropped out. I went and looked behind the scenes, because I didn't want the media, and looked at Trump's family relationships. They were incredible, as in terms of bringing the next generation along. So I see a lot of miscommunication, and I'd love for you to address where you come from with alternative views that you seem a little bit strong and not variable or potentially yielding in what
I'm prepared to be persuaded otherwise. Trump is not a racist.
There's a black man saying he's not a racist, and he knows.
Well, you know, I mean, how can you hear the rhetoric about immigrants and make that conclusion?
Well, I dig through a little further to see who he's referring to. A lot of it's misrepresented. So this is not the venue for that. I'm just curious as to where you're coming from in certain of these areas. We can talk about it differently.
Sure.
I spent a lot of time in Hanover. We used to come to Middlebury every winter.
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't know where to start.
Okay.
Yeah, you'd have to persuade me otherwise, I think.
Ben Carson's persuaded me. That guy, I followed him long before any of this stuff came up.
Okay.
The guy's incredible.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, yes.
I know that the thrust of your talk is on evangelicalism. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on essentially the rise of evangelicalism in this century and the relative decline of the mainline Protestant churches, and if you have any insights into that, the condition of those.
I said a minute ago that I think religion functions best on the margins of society and not in the councils of power. What happened to mainline Protestantism in the 1950s and 1960s is that mainline Protestants aspired to be in the councils of power. If you look at the National Council of Churches, it was a huge and very influential movement. The head of the National Council of Churches could demand an appointment with the president almost any time, until Johnson shut them out because of their opposition to the war in Vietnam. But that's another matter. Mainline Protestants became very complacent, and at the same time, evangelicals were understood how to communicate to the masses. The genius of evangelicalism throughout American history is that evangelicals know how to speak the idiom of the culture. From the open-air preaching of George Whitefield in the 18th century, I mentioned earlier, to the coal porters running the train lines in the 19th century, the circuit riders riding in the South, their circuits in the South, organizing churches. In the 20th century, you had people like Billy Sunday and his urban revivalism, Billy Graham and his urban crusades. And more recently, you have megachurches, which speak the language of suburbia fluently. They know how to do it. And evangelicalism is not constrained by confessions or creeds, liturgical rubrics, ecclesiastical hierarchies. It's always experimental. We're always trying something new. And if it doesn't work, they'll discard it and try something else new until they get people to follow. And people come. Mega churches are all over the place. My wife and I, she just left a minute ago, were in Charleston, South Carolina a few weeks ago, and my brother insisted that we go to this mega church. Thousands and thousands of people. Just finished constructing a whole new auditorium to accommodate the crowds. They can't. There's not adequate parking for all these people. But evangelicals know how to speak the idiom of the culture. Mainline Protestants don't. And I say that with a great deal of sadness because I'm an Episcopal priest. I'm doing supply work right now down in southwestern Vermont, and it's sad. It's sad. Please.
What kind of advice would you have for a progressive Lutheran who's had a bee in the bonnet for decades now, since a number of the Lutheran branches merged?
Yep.
Good idea.
Maybe.
Decided to give themselves a name, evangelical.
Yeah. Right. Oh, you don't like that? Well, no, they were using evangelical in the sense of Lutheran.
Yes, they are.
The 16th century, yes.
But it doesn't mean that anymore.
It doesn't, but I actually applauded them for taking that name, trying to reclaim the name. I thought that was a good... Getting back, relating to the previous question, I would, maybe in another lecture, call into question the wisdom of all these murders on the part of mainline groups, mainline Protestants. I think we're living in an age of particularity rather than amalgamation. Think about television. Most of us grew up with 3 television channels, and PBS. If we got the UHF dial just right. Now what? 500,000, whatever they are. They're all worthless except for baseball, but we're living in a different age where distinctions, I think, are important. And one of the downfalls of mainline Protestantism is that the theology has become so bland and generic that it means nothing.
Not Lutherans.
We can talk about that.
You mentioned
Okay.
you mentioned young evangelicals before,
Yep.
who had a more diverse view of their religion.
Yeah.
Are there spokespeople in the young group that are of renown and could change the tide a little bit?
Yeah, there's a younger generation that's emerging. Actually, tragically, one of their number just died at the age of 37. Rachel Helen Evans.
Yeah.
Quite sad. She was a real bright light, I thought, for evangelicals. Probably the best known in the younger generation would be Shane Claiborne.
Oh yeah.
Shane Claiborne is actually a former student of Tony Campolo, I mentioned earlier. He's a kind of Protestant monk, actually. He makes his own clothes. He lives in the urban area of Philadelphia. He's a community activist, and he loves Jesus. And people are paying attention. Younger generation. He's a rock star on college campuses. He's great.
His name again?
Shane Claiborne, C-L-A-I-B-O-R-N-E.
I would say that a lot of what divides Christians is the way the Bible is used.
Sure.
I want you to say something about that.
Yeah, the comment was that a lot of what divides Christians is the way the Bible is used. And that's what keeps me employed. That's why I study. And nowhere more so than in the United States, where, and it goes back to the Reformation. I mean, what Luther said was sola scriptura. The Bible alone is a source of authority, whereas in the Catholic Church it's the Bible, yes, but the Bible is interpreted by tradition, by the Church. And once you lose that part of it, you can go everywhere. Last I checked, in my yearbook, there were 54, I think, denominations of Baptists in America. Denominations. Baptists. Far too many Baptists by any reckoning. But it's a huge, it's a massive movement. And it has to do with people interpreting the Bible in slightly different ways. I mean, take the issue of baptism itself, right? Lutherans, Episcopalians, Catholics, you sprinkle. Baptist insists on Fulmer, you got to get wet to be Baptist. You got to be really wet to be Baptist, and it has to do with different interpretations of the Bible. The Baptists say, "Hey, look, where do you find any evidence in the Bible for sprinkling, let alone sprinkling infants?" And they got a point. They got a point. So I mean, that's a legacy of the Reformation. I mean, once you insist that you have only the Bible, sola scriptura, and you also couple that with the doctrine of the priesthood of believers, that each of us is responsible directly to God, you have people reading the Bible for themselves. And in fact, that's what happened during the Reformation era, is that there was this huge surge of literacy because people wanted to read the Bible for themselves. But as they did that, they read it in different ways. They read different parts of the Bible and they interpreted it in different ways.
People can use the Bible to find places that support their prejudices.
Absolutely. Sure.
And that's happening.
No, I mean, that's what's happened on the abortion issue. I mean, if you look for a biblical case against abortion, you're hard-pressed. Now, there are a couple of verses you can say, well, this is a justification for that. But you're pretty hard-pressed to make a solid theological argument against abortion from the Bible. I think you'd be hard-pressed to make a solid theological argument for abortion as well. But that's part of the point here. Homosexuality. There's a place in Leviticus, another verse in Romans that seem to be condemnatory about that. But there are other ways to interpret that, and that's part of as I said, that's what keeps me employed. Yes, please. Yes.
You're speaking, I think I can say accurately, to probably a fairly liberal, progressive audience.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to take half of us and replace these people with, say, deep South evangelicals,
Yep.
where would we have common ground?
What a great question.
What is the question?
If half of this audience were folks from the South, and I was addressing this group, what would be the common ground? What common ground could we reach in this gathering? I mean, this is going to sound platitudinous, and I'm sorry, but I believe it. I believe that we could reach common ground on the importance of discourse, for example, civil discourse, which I think is awfully important and a lost art today in our society that is so saturated with social media, for which people are unaccountable in large measure, unfortunately. Part of the problem. I think we could also reach common ground in saying that we need to embrace and uphold the canons of democracy. which includes civil discourse. I mean, that's the top of the list for democracy, but also includes equality. What makes me patriotic is not flag waving, but it's a sense over the course of history that we as a people have eventually come or are eventually trying to embrace the principles encoded into our charter documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, far too belatedly when it comes to people of color, far too belatedly when it comes to women, but we're getting there. And that's what makes me patriotic. That's what makes me hopeful. I think we can agree on that. I would like to think we would agree on that. Yes?
I'm 100% on where you're coming from with that. What comes up in my mind with abortion, the driver for me, I think, is justice. Would you address that side of it? That we have one voice and the other voice is totally obliterated, and that's where the country rises up against it. Does that make sense to you?
Explain, what voice is
Well,
obliterated?
first place, background is a little bit, comes from medicine. Medicine embraced Roe and Wade initially because of the illegal stuff that was creating such havoc.
Sure.
So it came on board to deal with that issue, and I have friends, classmates that are still there. It's morphed into a huge destructive force, and it's become a social issue in a lot of areas. So
what has become a destructive force?
Abortion itself,
okay.
the destruction of life.
Okay.
And where medicine came into that was suddenly medicine backed out when we started getting the cameras involved and seeing that this was a live individual in there that was actually acting against it. I mean, this is really gross, but when they started using the vacuum type abortion and this fetus was moving away from it and trying to avoid it, they suddenly realized, and a lot of guys were involved that suddenly said, no way, I'm not in there anymore. So that's where the division comes from the cellular level to the living being, which is a struggle today. And what I'm seeing is the justice issue that comes out of the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, that we have, this is the poor. A fetus is the poor. And the people who, this is a very generous country, and so they go to those that are unfortunate. And I think that's the background of abortion, which you put it in the evangelical phase, which is one extreme of that, but there's another total extreme that this is unjust to be able to take a living being and destroy them just because of some drug dealing issue or something else has totally distorted the mind of the person who's the
Okay, all right. No, I take your point, and yes. I have certain sympathy.
You think it has a value in there?
Yeah, but I think there's another question as well.
Okay, go.
And that is, do we really want the government regulating gestation?
No.
Do we really want the government regulating gestation? I think, so you frame the issue in a certain way, and I find it very compelling, I have to say. And as I said earlier, I think there is a moral conversation to be held. But the other issue is legality and politics. I mean, one way I have to say it is that I have no interest in making abortion illegal. I would love to make it unthinkable.
That's my correct.
But that's a different approach from what you're saying,
I understand that.
Because it says we need to take certain steps as a society to provide sex education, availability of contraceptions and so forth, but also change the moral climate so that it would be unthinkable to do this. By the way, I rarely push my own denomination, but the Episcopal Church has a very, very intelligent statement on this issue that just came out fairly recently, in which they say, we stand against abortion if it's been being used for sex selection or merely convenient. What were some of the other things in that statement? But we also think that legally it should be allowed. So I think there's a distinction between abortion as a legal issue and as a moral issue. And I don't think the legal issue is going to, frankly, is going to diminish the incidence of abortion.
You put the government in this in one area, and that is murder. And the government is involved in murder, so what is defining here is when this becomes a being.
All right.
And then murder is part of the issue.
Okay,
Yeah.
when does the government issue a birth certificate? At conception?
We can move it back. To 12 weeks.
I think this might be a good time for us to end, and I think if Liz gives people a chance to leave if they want to leave, then perhaps if you have any further questions you'd like to ask tonight's speaker, we can do that.
And I got to teach in the morning.